welcome back to another episode of When Life Feels Messy, episode 14. We are
Yes.
so excited to be back for another episode. I am one of your wonderful, wonderful hosts, Erin Raspberry.
Hello, and I am your other wonderful, wonderful host, Ashley Barrera.
And our topic today is sexual health awareness, as September is also this awareness month. I know last year we covered suicide awareness because that's a big one that's talked about, but something that might not be talked about as much is that September is also sexual health awareness month. So we wanted to give that its much needed attention and time in today's podcast episode and topic.
I feel like also that last September was a quote unquote taboo or, maybe uncomfortable topic. And so is this one. I'm proud of ourselves for, having these combos.
What is up with September being the taboo topics? Loving
exactly.
it. Okay.
Well, let's get right into it.
Yeah.
We wanted to start with an icebreaker question that you and I are both going to answer is, what does sexual health mean to us individually?
That's a good one.
Yeah. And it took me I had to think about this question a little bit because yes, I'm passionate about awareness and learning about stuff, but I'm how does this apply to me specifically?
Yeah.
With my therapy hat on and without my therapy hat on, just as a woman in the world. And for me, my sexual health means to me learning about things about my body, mind, connection that impact my sexual health, in learning about that area of life that I don't really spend or didn't even grow up learning about. It's, like I said, a taboo topic, and it sometimes feels a little awkward, or sometimes or our bodies feel like it's wrong to talk about it, especially out loud to people that are not our partners or our close friends or family. So to me, it's about being informed, learning about my body mind connection and how it relates to my overall sexual well-being, and with that information actively choosing partners or events or even ideas to learn about what I like and what I don't like. And yeah.
Yeah, no, I think I would definitely validate, emphasize, do the exclamation thing on an iPhone message, right? Everything you just said. And I think for me, thinking about maybe even more broader, core element of sexual health is although I wasn't raised in an environment or it wasn't something that was taught to me or ingrained in me, right? It's being able, in this present moment, in this space, to say my sexual health is something that I am deserving and worthy of knowing, about, whether that's having knowledge about various aspects of it, right? Including my body parts and how that works, right? About pleasure, about different elements and things that I deserve to know about, right?
Yes.
As well as really having this, I don't want to say confidence, but I guess it is kind of confidence in that my sexual health is just as important as my physical, my mental, my emotional, well-being, right? And I feel we know physical health is talked about all the time, right? It's one of the top things. And we're, slowly building the mental, emotional, health, bar up, I think, with even attacking the stigma against mental health in general, which we face every day, right?
Exactly. Yeah.
But I think if we were to look at it, it would be physical health's way up here, mental health is probably halfway, and then sexual health would be barely skirting at the bottom, right?
Yeah.
Like, it's
Yeah.
definitely not something that is talked about enough. It's not taught enough. Like,
Right.
and so in thinking about, like, I think in the essence of my sexual health is something that I like have the ability and deserve to know about and have
Mm-hmm.
resources and accessibility to all different things. But I think you're right, right? Like it is taboo. Like it isn't brought up, it isn't talked about enough. And it like makes me even think about like this idea of it's uncomfortable for people, right, to talk about and like how we've seen that even throughout our lives or in
Yeah.
future generations, right? And like
Yeah.
the impact of that. So I'm
Yes.
curious on your mindset on that.
Well, with that, it's like bringing up like, yeah, it's so uncomfortable to talk about, but I know for me personally, it was also like so uncomfortable to think about just
Yeah.
by myself,
Mhm.
you know, and then also having this, um, I don't know, norm of you figure it out on your own. Like,
Right.
having family members or people that are supposed to teach you stuff about life, of like, you'll figure it out. Like, how
Mhm.
am I going to figure it out?
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think
So,
that that's
yeah.
a good point to bring up, right? It's like almost like a
Yeah.
bird being pushed out of the nest, like you're expected to just fly and figure it out.
Yeah. Like growing up, I never knew the like term sexual health.
Mm-mm.
Like, oh, there's different types of health. Like you said, mental health, physical health.
Right.
Sexual health is also just as important.
Yeah.
And having a pod like this where we can start talking about what that encompasses is something I really wish I had.
Yeah,
You know?
I know. It's kind of like I think it reminds me of what I hear a lot, or like I think is like really broadcasted in movies is this like idea of like mothers, right? Of like wanting to give their children what they didn't have, right? Or like
Mm-hmm.
setting them up to like accomplish more, be able to do more things than what they could. And I almost feel like that with this pod of like, I wish I had had this or heard someone talking about this so openly. And
Yeah.
like, I want to give it to my air quotes babies, right? Of like
Yeah.
the younger generations or anyone who listens to this, right? And would benefit
Exactly.
from hearing us talk about it. Um,
Yeah. So
so
let's get into it. Like starting off, I really wanted to make sure that we talk about the like professional definitions of sexual health
mhm,
that come from like two different places, two different organizations. But the first one is the World Health Organization. Defines sexual health as a state of physical, emotional, mental, and social well being in relation to sexuality. It is not merely the absence of disease, dysfunction, or infirmity. I hope I said that right. Sexual health requires a positive and respectful approach to sexuality and sexual relationships, as well as the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences. This next part is so important.
mhm,
Free of coercion, discrimination, and violence. Ugh, when I
mhm.
read that, I was like, yes, like, yes, yes, yes. Like, this is something that is so important to highlight. And I'm so happy that they put in this in their definition. So,
Right, because I don't
thanks
think
for
it
that.
is highlighted enough. Like
Mm-mm.
you never, at least for me, like I didn't even realize what coercion like could look like in a sexual or any
Exactly.
relationship, right? But if we're
Right.
talking specifically sexual here, like how many people, right, feel coerced into like sexual acts or whatever of any kind?
Exactly. Yes. So the next definition we have is from the American Psychological Association, and they define sexual health as sexuality encompasses all aspects of sexual behavior, including gender identity, orientation, attitudes, and activity.
Mhm.
Something also very important to highlight.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So with that, I think that we have some like clear words, clear phrases of like what sexual health is not just defined as, but what it means to us individually, and
Mm.
can help us transition to a more like specific part of sexual health. So let's talk about consent.
Yes, let's.
Let's. Did you know there are various types of consent that are all important and vital in any sexual situation? When approaching a sexual relationship with another person, it is necessary to have these conversations and ask questions. So, here are some things to consider.
Yes, thank you, Ashley.
You're welcome.
I think too of like, even before like getting into this, right? Like we hear the buzzword consent, right? Like
Mm,
I think if anything, like that has definitely been coming out more, right, in society of like consent, like there's whole movements about it, right, to combat like the
yeah.
sexual like assault, harassment, like the horrible statistics that come up, and I'm not going to get into that because it's a whole other conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But really like looking at informing people of what consent is, right? And everyone's like right to consent. Like, I think a big thing, like, I hope that is the takeaway from this before we get into the specifics is that no matter who you're in a relationship with, the elements of the relationship, like how you identify, who you love, whatever, none of that diminishes or takes away from your right to consent. You are a human being. You have the like given right as a person with your own unique elements to have and give consent in any type of sexual relationship.
Exactly. Yes. Let's just take a moment to, yes.
Ah,
Yes.
yes.
And that's like so powerful to hear, honestly. Like people don't know, especially children don't grow up knowing that they have that right.
Right. Yeah. And I think like that kind of makes me think of if this is a little tangent and you're gonna be like, Aaron, why are we tangenting? But I'm gonna tangent for a second and I'm gonna come back, I promise. But like that makes me think of like even for me personally growing up in a highly strict religious area of sex was only meant for reproduction. Right? Like there was
Right.
not the pleasure aspect of it. There was not this like trying new things, figuring out what you like, all that stuff. And we'll get to pleasure later. I'm really excited to talk about that. But like it was strictly a, you know, what a man and women, all air quotes on that, like partaken as a married couple in order to like create babies, right? And I think
Yep.
like even like with that, it's how much is left out or not talked about at all in regards to sexual health and all that is
Exactly.
out there in regards to that. And it makes me like even sad for like thinking of myself. Like I even within the last like maybe 10-ish less, probably less than that years of figuring out what that actually looks like, right? And how many people like might go their whole life like without even thinking that they have the right or ability to access like what sexual health fully looks like. So
Exactly.
that's my little tangent, but I will get back to the point
That's a
here.
good tangent. I'm glad. Yes.
But kind of segueing it back to consent. Hopefully, if anything, that you walk away from this knowing that consent is a necessary and vital part of any sexual relationship that you're going to get in. Whether or not you plan to be in a relationship with this person, if this is like a one night thing and you never talk to them, whatever it is, right? It doesn't matter the length of the relationship or the feelings, emotions, etc. Like consent has to be a vital part of that. And I don't think that that is said enough. that consent always needs to
Exactly.
be given from both parties and respected, right, from both parties on whether if someone says, no, I don't give consent, like that needs to be respected. And I think that's where the line gets really mulled, like, it's because people are like, I can change your answer, right?
Exactly. Literally. Or they're not hearing the person when they like are not consenting. They
Yeah,
continue to prioritize them and their wants, right? And
exactly.
sometimes that makes the other person feel unsafe and like freeze,
Mhm.
like,
Yes. No, and I think too of like maybe like a disclaimer here, right? Of like anyone that's listening to this, like understanding that this might be a little triggering right now because consent is something that the lack of is usually very much tied to sexual assault that occurs.
yep,
And so disclaimer on that, and also too, like if you're hearing this, like hope that you know that you are not responsible for someone feeling like they deserve to be pleased or get what they want more than your own wants and needs. Like
exactly.
your wants and needs, your consent is 100% valid and just as important as the other person's. And I think a lot of people don't hear that and need to, right?
Yeah, yeah, for sure.
So,
And this is like bringing up, I know for me in my clinical work of within this realm of like sexual assault or sexual harassment, of hearing the same story about I froze and I couldn't say
mm,
anything, and that like wiped away, or for the other person that was like, oh, they're consenting because they're not saying no.
right,
And
right.
that is just so gross to me. Like,
Mm,
if the person does not say, yes, I want this, or yes, I'm consenting to this,
right.
then you don't have an answer. Then you don't have the go ahead, right? Like,
Mm,
no answer is also an answer. That like no response means no.
yes.
Like, let's
Yeah.
be like on the like cautious end of decision making,
Mhm.
right? Of like, hey, I'm not getting a clear response from you right now.
Yeah.
I don't want to like pressure you. And that can be really challenging when you're having these visceral or emotional responses in your own body
Mm,
that you got to regulate.
right. Yeah. Yeah. And I think too of like, I think there needs to be some accountability here on if you are feeling that like my consent is not being validated, right? Or like I said no, or that even if I said like I'm not sure, right? And that like the other person is still like not respecting that, doing whatever they want to do, and you go into like that freeze mode, right? Of can we put some accountability on the other person, like totally ignoring not only your silence, right? But ignoring the fact that your body language is going to be stiff and not active, definitely not showing like nonverbals of being like interested or having like a pleasurable time. Like there are key signs, even if you don't say anything, that would show someone that you are not interested in this, that you do not want this. And
Exactly.
I might be a little blunt here, but that's some crap. That is
Mm-hmm.
some crap for someone to completely ignore that and still say, well, I want to be pleasured here. Like me having an orgasm or whatever is more important. So I'm going to do what I want. Like, I got some fingers for you, but whatever.
Yeah.
But okay, I'm
Completely
really gonna get
agree.
back. I'm gonna
Yes.
get back
Circle
to it.
back. Circling
I'm
back.
circling back.
Hmm.
But okay, like we said, consent needs to be the main aim, right? Like, so in thinking about like when you're having conversations or having like even just like interactions with a person that it could happen, right? Like we could have a sexual like interaction together or like I'm thinking about it or whatever. Like thinking about is consent part of that conversation, right? Because we have to put consent first. We have to make it like part of it because it's not okay and it makes it so much more like complicated and a lot of different layers if you wait to ask for consent after the fact or even later, right? Like it makes it much more like where a lot of times people are like, okay, whatever, right? Or like freeze or feel like, well, I like feel responsible that this other person got excited, right? So I'll just like go along with it. And it's like, no,
Yeah,
no.
absolutely no.
So like really like taking the time of discussing consent with like whoever, right? Like, and this is not, I don't want this to be like, we're only talking about a monogamous thing. Like, no, like, this is whoever, right? Like, the other parties involved in the sexual experience, like, this needs to be talked about and received from every single person that will be engaged in this. Because everyone deserves that, right? Like that is a basic human element of respect that everyone deserves to be able to give consent, and for that consent to be respected. Now, thinking about informed consent, right? So, is everyone that's involved in this, like sexual interaction, whatever, aware of what's going to be offered, right? Like, do they have all the information to make a decision on if they want to participate or not, right? And I think like going back, like I've heard before of like I agreed to maybe like a certain like act, right? And then like as we're getting into it, someone decides to like whip out something new, right? Or like wants to try new things. And like we never had a conversation about that. I never was able to like give a safe word or say if I'm comfortable with that. And that's not okay, right? Like that is very disrespectful for the other person and not taking in consideration of what feels good or not, right? Like, and so like that needs to be a part of it of everyone knows clearly, right? Or even is able to say like, hey, like I'm open to like if this turns into something like more intensely, right? Or more aggressively, right? If that's what people like. But having that even like more broad sense of I'm okay with this, right? And that's
Yes,
vocalized. And also knowing that you can take that back at any time. You do
exactly.
not have that written in stone. It's like once I say it,
Exactly.
it is like in same for the rest of my life. Absolutely not. This is a living, breathing like entity that can be changed and morphed and whatever for the duration of your life. Like you get the will and
Yeah.
ability to change that.
Or even like that same in those same moments,
Mhm.
like,
Yeah.
okay, I'm feeling triggered, or I actually just don't even like this. This doesn't even feel comfortable. Or
Yes.
like I want to
Yes.
stop and this is stopping.
Right. Exactly. Which leads me to my next one, which is like ongoing consent, right? Like is consent something that like not only that we have before, during, and after the sexual encounter, right? But like, is this also something that we have every time that we have a sexual interaction, right? Like, and so like you were saying, like I might have really enjoyed like whipping being part of a sexual like relationship at first. And maybe after some time, I'm not as into it, right? Like, I have the ability to say, I don't want that anymore. Even if I did in the past, like, I can say I don't want that because our sexual, like, pleasure and things that we like changes over time. Like, we, like, learn new things. We figure out what works for our body, especially as our body is growing, right? Like, older, like, things might
Exactly.
not feel the same. And so, like, that needs to be an important part of it of, like, there has to be ongoing consent. It's not I say it once and that serves for the rest of our time together. That can't be a part of it because then that's when the sexual assault starts to come in, right? Of is someone okay with this or not? Thinking about relational consent, right? So thinking the relationship between individuals, right? So which of the parties can bring all their needs, their wants, their boundaries to the forefront, right? Like this is something that it needs to be able to say everyone has a say, everyone has their needs and wants like put out there and respected, and it's not one person gets to do that and the other does not, right? Like it needs to be a very like mutual thing. For I mean people to be able to like enjoy it, right? For there to be like that
Yeah.
pleasure aspect. And also too, I think something we'll talk about a little later is like I think that kind of can go hand in hand with the power play, which don't
Yeah.
get me wrong, there are some people who love that, right? Like that is an essence and part of their
Mhm.
pleasure principle in their activities is like wanting to feel like they don't have power or they do have power. But
Mhm.
in those situations, like BDSM or whatever, like there is an agreement, there is consent, there is safe words, like there is a whole like almost contract that
Yeah,
is
literally.
created for that. And so just kind of keeping in mind on that. Consent and wanting. So someone has to be fully down, right, to do something sexually for consent to be valid. If someone says, I'm not really sure, I don't know if I like that, that's not consent. That's not someone wanting it fully. So that needs to be something that is taken into consideration, right? And thinking about, okay, like if this is something where we both agree to like experiment and try, right? Like and the other person agrees to that, gives full consent to try, cool. That's when it's going to be really important to have a safe word to like maybe like take things slower, maybe figure out, like kind of working our way up to things like that. But if a person is consistently, I'm not sure, or I don't think I would like that has to be respected. Whether or not the other partner is like really into that or not, like that it doesn't mean that one's needs and wants gets thrown away almost, if that makes sense.
Exactly. Yeah, for sure.
And I think with all that being said, like consent equals healthy communication.
Mm-hmm.
And that has to be essential, right? Like we have to be able to vocalize and hear, right, what someone is giving consent or not giving consent. We have to be able to respect that. We have to be able to read like our sexual partner's body language, right? Like someone might give consent, right? And think they're okay with it. And then like midway through, you notice they tense up, right? Or like something happens or they don't feel like as
Yeah,
into it. And that's the point where we stop and we check in with them of like, hey, what's going on? Right? Because this is not just about one person's pleasure. Like if that was the case, you would just be masturbating.
exactly. Yes.
So that's what I'm gonna say to that. And I'm gonna turn it over to you, Ash.
Yes. So I know what I'm about to speak on, you've already touched here and there with talking about consent, specifically with power awareness.
Sorry,
And
I get excited.
I know that's okay. Like, I think it all flows together and it's good to have those examples.
Mhm.
And I love that how you had those examples of what questions to ask or how to communicate those in the relationship. So it's really important to note that all relationships come with power dynamics and not just monogamous relationships, but all
Mhm.
relationships.
Yeah,
And that can impact consent.
right.
This is related to the relational consent that you touched on because
Mhm.
it accounts for the dynamic between individuals, right? So, not just what's about to happen, but how we are in relation to each other. And
Right.
it's also important to note each individual has their own different understanding of themselves sexually.
Mhm.
Talking about consent might be something new because
Yeah.
it's is a rare or taboo topic to have when you want to hook up with someone and you think they're attractive, or maybe even your partner of like 10 years.
Mhm.
So power dynamics infringe on consent when one person has power over another. So these are some things that you want to think about and consider. Are all parties aware of the cultural, relational, and personal power dynamics and imbalances within this interaction? Do these dynamics impact a person's ability to give or revoke consent in a safe way? So, like you said earlier, the power dynamics can be influenced by so many things,
Mhm.
right? The person's own identity of themselves or where they feel like they are in their relationship or even within society if they feel like they're less than or they're still working on their self-worth or they have a really big ego because they make all this money or they accomplish all these household tasks, right? Like having an honest conversation about power dynamics, not just like if you're a couple, but even if like, oh, I'm a male in this world. And that, unfortunately, has more power in society.
Yeah. Yeah.
But as a woman, some may have that identity of like, I'm way more powerful because I can birth children, right? Or I can withstand, my pain tolerance is a lot more than men. And that can also feel like impacts the power dynamic. So just taking a moment to think about your own like sense of self in that way. And then you also touched on this next one a little bit too, of accountability, right? Should we cross a line and invalidate or violate someone else's consent? For example, if we behaved in a non-consensual way, are we able to confront this person, apologize, or figure out a way to not make this mistake again? Because sex is not perfect and we will make mistakes. And even just the part of apologizing, right? And holding yourself accountable is something that a lot of people struggle with outside of sex.
Yeah.
So the key is being willing to hold yourself accountable and do what it takes to regain trust.
Yeah.
And I know like in this part, there can be a lot of shame around making mistakes or hurting someone else. And, you know, I've personally struggled with that too, like getting stuck in the shame vortex. But it's really important to just know that what can truly help you get out of that is self-accountability. And not just within yourself, but being able to communicate and express that to others.
Yeah.
It's so important in this in your sexual health realm.
Yeah. I do want to add to, I think it's important to note of like if there is a situation where you cross a line, where you violate someone's consent, right? Like I think a necessary vital thing is to hold yourself accountable, right? Like own up to like crossing that line, apologizing, finding a way to like even like just like make the other person feel safe. But that does not directly correlate with that person having or in the future like wanting to have sex with you again. Or wanting to have an interaction with you. You do not like deserve, or that does not equal like you getting that just because you hold yourself accountable and apologize. Right? Because there could be varying like degrees of like how you cross that line, right? And some things like could be something that the other person like can't come back from, right? Can't regain that trust with you. And so there needs to be a level of like humility there too of like if I like crossed the line in X, Y, Z, right? Like and I did this, like I need to be very aware and hold myself that like doing that, like the other person has a right to say like they don't want anything else to do with me, right?
Yes. I'm so glad you mentioned that because it just really distinguishes like repair versus a conversation about consent.
Right.
Right? Like repairing whatever mistake it was or holding yourself accountable does not equate like consent.
Oh, yeah. And that's what I'm saying. Like some people like, like will be able to potentially build trust, to be able to have consent, like gives consent and like want to have sex again with that person. And some people will be like, I'm out. Like, and that has to be respected.
Yep. Yes. Well, thank you for touching on that for sure. Yeah. So to wrap up on consent, ensuring open and honest communication about consent is crucial for both singles and couples to foster healthy and respectful relationships. It is essential to establish a comfort zone where all parties involved can feel safe discussing boundaries, desires, and expectations. When bringing up the topic of consent, keep in mind that it should be an ongoing conversation rather than a one-on-one discussion.
Yeah. Yeah. Have that conversation and discussion multiple times, as many times, like as you want.
So
like there's not a limit.
Yeah. So let's transition to a little bit of what this ongoing conversation could entail, which is safer sex practices, right? So we've been talking about consent. Yes. And like conversating and having a dialogue. And something that really needs to be a part of these conversations is the safer sex practices. Like, what does that look like? What does that entail?
Yes. I want to insert something here of like, if you just heard Ash say safer sex practices and something in your body was like, ew, gross, I don't want to hear about this, etc., you're part of the problem. And you need to listen to this section of our podcast. Great. Awesome. Continue on, Ash.
Love the compassionately calling out. Love it. Okay. So, safer sex can actually be fun, exciting, and very pleasurable because you're creating a safe environment. You're creating a safe vibe. Okay. It can make your sex more relaxed and satisfying by decreasing your worry about getting or spreading sexually transmitted infections or diseases. So we're going to keep to the acronyms of STIs and STDs. Okay, because that's a very long label.
It's a mouthful.
Yeah, it's a mouthful. So it is also a great chance to add variety in your sex life because you're feeling safe, right? You have the ability to build trust and intimacy with your partner by talking about each other's desires. Choosing to have safer sex shows that you care about pleasure and health, not only for yourself, but for your sexual partner or partners. Period.
Yep.
Boom. Okay.
Period.
Yes. So, with that being said, getting tested for STDs regularly is part of safer sex. Even if you always use barriers like condoms, that's totally okay. But also, like getting tested on the regular is part of that responsibility, that self accountability. Okay. Most people with STDs don't have symptoms or know they're infected, and they can easily pass the infection to their partners. So, something that I've recently learned is that even if you have an STD or an STI, you won't have symptoms. And you actually have to wait like 5 to 6 months from when you think you got infected to actually figure out in the test if you actually have the STD or STI. Because you won't have symptoms.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Well, I think too, like, something I've heard a lot is like this idea of, ew, like I don't want to go get tested or like get a checkup on myself. Like I'm fine, X, Y, and Z. And it's like, I think that's just another note of holding our sexual health is not as important as our physical or mental. Because if you were sick, right? If you thought you had COVID, right? If you like literally broke a bone or whatever, you wouldn't hesitate to go buy over-the-counter medicines, go to the doctor, get tested. Well, I mean, there's some people that refuse to acknowledge COVID, but whatever, that's a side note. We're not talking about those people. But you would literally go do that. On top of that, like in our big mental health movement is like you would go to therapy, talk to someone, learn coping skills for your emotions, go to a psychiatrist or doctor about getting on medication. Like you would do that. So why the heck is it so taboo to be like, hey, my sexual health is important. I want to make sure that my body parts are working, everything is okay. I want to be safe for myself. I want to be safe for my future partners. Like, why is that not a standard? Because it's been so taboo.
I know, again, going on a little spiral about what was said earlier, but I really believe the shame about
just talking about sex and sexual health is really embedded in this particular thing of getting tested, because you're getting tested because you don't know, like you don't know something, right? And that can feel like, okay, I don't want to tell anyone, right? I don't want anyone to know I'm getting tested, or anyone to know the results. And let's just like alleviate the shame a little bit, like, or a lot of it actually. Okay.
Right. Yeah.
Because you're actually doing steps, like you said, to take care of yourself.
Right. Yeah.
Yes. So that's my little spew on STD testing and like shame. Okay. So continuing on with practicing safer sex includes.
Yes. Tag me in.
Tag you in, Erin.
Okay, so I think like important to know, and this is something going back to like I wasn't taught this. Like I feel like nobody really talked about STDs or STIs unless if they were like calling out someone or shaming someone, right? But it was like I didn't learn until probably college what that actually looked like, right? Like how that was actually transmitted and stuff. So in the spirit of that, like it's important for us to highlight this. Like so you have the knowledge of how exactly like STDs, STIs get like spread, right? So like practicing safer sex like really involves knowing what bodily fluids, right, are can be spread sexually between you and your partner, right? Like, what are the sexual activities that are risky for each person, right? How can you make this activity less risky? Because bodily fluids that can spread STIs include blood, and something I didn't know is this includes menstrual blood. So if you're on your period, in my head, I was like, they're separate, but I'm like, it's in your body. But like, it's not just like if I cut myself, right, or have like something and I'm bleeding, like it's like if you're having sex and you're on your period, which some people do, right? Like, there's a population of people that don't do that, but like some people do. And I don't know if that's something that's known. It wasn't taught to me for sure. Include like another thing is vaginal secretions, right? Like which we all do, right? Like we all like have like those as well as like semen. So not just come from an ejaculation, right? Like pre-cum can also transmit this. And any kind of anal fluids, which I know people are like, oh my God, did Erin just say anal fluids? Yes, I said anal fluids, or you can call it booty juices, like whatever you want to do. If anal fluid sounds gross, like you come up with a name for it.
Exactly.
But
we need to know.
Yeah, we have to know this, right? And like thinking about like one part of safer sex, like in order to kind of help be a barrier, right, to like these fluids transmitting between you and partners is to use barriers, right? So like things like condoms, both like male, internal, female condoms. Yes, that's a thing. Like how many of you weren't taught that there were female condoms, right? Like dental dams, which if you don't know are like those thin squares that like you can put over like the vaginal area that kind of prevents from like getting any of the fluids things like and potentially spreading that, right? Or even using gloves. And I don't know why I didn't think about that, but I'm like, I mean, it makes sense, right? Like, why wouldn't that make sense? Like healthcare people use that all the time. And there's a lot of sexual activities that don't pass sexual fluids or blood between bodies. And therefore, like, they don't really pose a threat to transmitting STIs. And so, like, doing some research on what that could look like. It's also possible to transmit or get sexually transmitted infections while sharing sex toys. And this was definitely not something taught to me. And as an LGBTQ plus woman, like this is important to know and it's not taught about, right? Like many people use like vibrators, dildos, butt plugs, like strap-ons, like as part of sex play, right? Like and it's not just used in the queer community, like it is used like across the board, right? So like let's just take that little stereotype out.
Exactly.
but they have to be clean, right? Just like you would wash your own like body parts, right? If you're having like penis, vagina, sex, like sex toys need to be clean too, because they're literally being inserted into your body.
Exactly.
Right?
Yes.
So, and that's not just if you're having sex with a partner. This is if you're masturbating and using it on yourself. Because if they're not clean, right, they can grow bacteria. They can cause an infection. And if you're not cleaning it, think about like you're sticking that in your body, right? Like what that can do, how that can throw off your pH balance, women. Like, and we know our thrown off pH balances cause a lot of issues for us, right?
Yes.
And sex toys are made of a lot of different materials, right? Like depending on what you get, could be silicone, could be rubber, could be vinyl, whatever. So they have to be cleaned in different ways. And it's important for you to not throw the instructions away when you get a sex toy, but make sure you understand like what cleaning like materials like are going to be necessary for this. Right. So I'm going to leave it with that. And I hope that was informational for you.
Very, very informational. Loving the full transparency. Like people need to know.
People need to know, and I'm here to like be a knowledge fairy bomb for you. And I think last thing before we kind of switch gears and talk about pleasure is like, in thinking about reproductive health, right? There is a lot going on in the world, a lot of differing opinions, a lot of differing laws, regulations, all kinds of stuff, right?
Oh, yeah.
I think we can definitely agree that the world is not in agreement on reproductive health, right? And we will be politically correct about that. So
of
what
course.
we do say, because we're not going to go into the nitty-gritty of it, but what we do encourage you is to take your time, right? Learn about your state's laws, learn about the regulations, learn about what resources are available and accessible to you when you're developing a plan in terms of reproduction, right? Or your reproductive health. And that's what we will say about that. And we are going to switch gears and move on to pleasure.
Yes. I just want to say that was beautifully said.
Thank you.
Love it. So,
Master of politically correct language.
So yeah, let's talk about pleasure. Let's transition to the pleasure realm of sexual health.
So in talking about pleasure, like something that I found that I thought was like just like a perfect way to sum it up was the World Association for Sexual Health had like a whole declaration about sexual pleasure, right? Like, and it's like almost like a living, breathing like Declaration of Independence about pleasure and sexual health. When I'm like, I need this, like, post it everywhere.
We are here for it.
Yes. But they hold that sexual pleasure is a fundamental part of our sexual rights, our sexual health, and our sexual well-being, right? So affirming that sexual pleasure is the physical and or psychological satisfaction and enjoyment that is derived from shared or solitary erotic experiences. And this includes our thoughts, fantasies, dreams, emotions, and feelings, right? So I want to share with you of their declaration of like really powerful, to the point, advocating like statements that they hold that I'm like, yes, like we need this to be like a worldwide declaration.
Yes.
So the first one is the possibility of having pleasurable and safe sexual experiences free of discrimination, coercion, and violence is a fundamental part of sexual health and well-being for all. And we heard that talked about like at the beginning of this, right? So just even like reiterating that. Access to sources of sexual pleasure is part of a human experience and subjective well-being. And I'm thinking like, how taboo do people like hold like sex stores, right? To be like, oh my gosh, like I wouldn't go in there. That's just like gross or whatever. It's like, no, like we have access to these things. We deserve to be able to use whatever like feels good for us, right?
Yepers.
Sexual pleasure is a fundamental part of sexual rights as a matter of human rights.
Ooh.
And I think this is like further like ties into like sexual health is just as important as our physical, mental, emotional, right? Of like our sexual like pleasure, our sexual rights is a fundamental part of being a human. Like we do not have like some people deserve it more than others. No, it's our right as a human. Sexual pleasure includes the possibility of diverse sexual experiences. So all that jargon on like, oh my gosh, like I'm gonna be in trouble if I have more than one partner, or like I have sex like with multiple people or whatever, right? Like this holds like, no, like we have the right to diverse sexual experiences. And I think too of like you can go into a lot of subcategories of like religious, spiritual beliefs, right? And it's like if that's what you believe, that's what you hold, cool, right? And that doesn't mean that everyone else that doesn't believe that or follow that, they're not subject to those rules and regulations. Sexual pleasure should be integrated into education, health promotion, and service delivery, research and advocacy in all parts of the world.
Ooh, okay. I really love this one.
Yes. Like, how different would it be if these were elements that were taught, like, throughout our education? How different would situations be, right? Like, it's just thinking about like knowledge is power, yet so much of the world today is about taking away knowledge or hiding certain things from people. And it's like, how does that work exactly? Like,
well, that's it. Power, the power dynamics. The less you know, the more power I have over you. Oh, tangent. Another tangent. Circle back.
Yeah, that's a whole other podcast. And the last one is like the programmatic inclusion of sexual pleasure to meet individuals' needs, aspirations, and realities ultimately contributes to global health and sustainable development, and it should require comprehensive, immediate, and sustainable action. And I'm like, yeah.
Yes.
Advocating for it, right? Like, so I really enjoyed like reading this. Their last little tidbit is our enjoyment of specific sexual behaviors and practices varies from one individual to another. And no matter what stimulates our individual sexual desires or what practices we use to satisfy them, we are all sexual beings, right? And how we choose to behave as a sexual being is up to us. And I think that's a pivotal part is whatever we choose, right, as like our sexual being and what works for us does not give us a right to hold others to that box.
Absolutely. Literally.
And I'm thinking of like all the stigma, all the like negativity that's given to people that are really into certain things like BDSM, the furry community, right? Like all kinds of stuff. And it's like your box or your like choices and what you like as a sexual being does not mean that everyone else has to follow that.
Exactly. Yes.
So I'm going to drop the mic on that one and turn it back over to you.
So what are some health benefits of pleasure? Sexual pleasure. Okay. Sex has been shown to promote better sleep habits, less stress, more happiness, right? A better mood, right? Sex is a healthy bodily function. And our bodies thrive on the chemicals released during orgasm. So a healthy sex life is indeed part of a healthy body. Let's just hold space for that, right? Like, a lot of the times, I don't know why, but my brain just keeps popping up the shame cycle. Like, there's so much shame or like negative connotations around sex. And when we actually look at the evidence, the research about the benefits, it's like, whoa.
Yeah.
It's so beneficial to just your whole physical and emotional well-being. So how will you experience sexual pleasure? Like, how do you know you're in the pleasure vibe? How do you know you are enjoying yourself fully, viscerally, emotionally, mentally, right? It's important to note there isn't a right way to experience sexual pleasure. So let's start with a rich fantasy life, like almost like warming up the engine with, things you've written out in your head. If you have a partner, he or she might enjoy this as much as you do, right? Talk about it with your partner. Understand that sexual pleasure is a matter of mutual interest. Remember that consenting adults can be as sexually adventurous as they please.
Yes.
And don't forget that your partner is likely to have an entirely different set of favorite stimuli. So again, going back to having a conversation, a dialogue, and having trust in your relationship, right? Having a partner that's understanding is so key to feel safe to have these conversations about what turns you on, what turns you off, what you want to try, what worked and what didn't work, being curious about their interests and their things that, drive them crazy in a good way, right? And being open-minded about like not internalizing anything negatively about you, more of like, I'm curious to like unlock or learn about what my partner's inner experience is.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
I think something that pops up in my head too is like this idea of you and your partner have to like the same things in order to have like a good relationship, right? Or a good sex life. And it's like, no, like you and your partner are completely different people, right? And so like part of I think like the fun of it is figuring out what you both like, right? And being able to like incorporate that. So maybe like your partner really enjoys like a certain thing and you're not as into it, but maybe you like performing that on the person, right? Like that could be something that's part of it and doesn't mean that like you have to like use that thing or that be done to you if it's not your cup of tea, but it's ways to like almost like give pleasure and experiment with things that work for both of you in different ways. And it doesn't mean that you have to both use the same method, both do X, Y, and Z. Like that's not a part of it necessarily. If it is, cool, but it doesn't mean it has to be.
Yeah, for sure. And with that, you're touching on communication. Communication is key. Let's just like underline that, highlight it.
I know.
It's so important. Because the act of sex and sexual pleasure is a way of communication.
Right.
Like with your bodies.
Yeah.
And with your emotions, right? So a successful long-term relationships, they are based on communication, healthy communication. Feeling safe from disease and trusting our partner is a foundation for comfortable, relaxed, healthy sex. Safety, comfort, and trust allows us to freely discuss our sexual needs and limitations with a partner. So be direct. Okay, that might feel weird, but be direct and speak up.
Right.
And some examples of this could sound like, I really like when you touch this part, or you do this leading up to, or you do this during, right? Or I really enjoy when we text all day long, creating that sexual tension, right? And when we see each other in person, it's like, wow,
Yeah.
Or you could ask, would you like me to do X, Y, and Z, right? So if you're starting a new relationship or you've been in a long-term relationship, it's really important to like communicate curiosity of what your partner likes so that you already know going into it.
Yeah.
And again, having comfortability with the consent of like, okay, like I know what you like. Would you like me to do this? Or even before of like, I'm consenting you to do this at this time.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
And let's go for it. So open, frank conversation with your partner is mandatory to giving and receiving sexual pleasure. And I know like this kind of feels like, as we're talking about it, it's come up for me of like, oh, talking about sex and like all these things before it actually happens takes the fun out of it, takes like the excitement out of it. And I'm like, I understand that and I've been there, but also you are not a mind reader and your partner's not a mind reader.
Right.
And you're kind of cheating yourself out of a great, safe, wonderful experience if you're not communicating about it beforehand.
Mm-hmm.
And also, let me like asterisk this because it's like so important that I really want to make sure that I say during this podcast is that just because you have conversations with your partner or this one night stand or whoever it is about consent and about your desires or what you like and what you don't like does not mean that you're ready to have sex with them. You're just learning. You're in the exploratory phase, right? That does not have the green light of like, let's do this the next time we meet or like 10 minutes from now. No, like that also deserves open, direct communication of like, okay, now I'm ready.
Mm-hmm.
Right?
I like that point. Yeah. I think that was a really good, like, almost like ending note, like that section of, yeah, like you're right. Like that has to be like a known part and almost like underlying thing of it every time.
Yeah. It's almost like, I know it's not related, but let's say like, okay, me and you are talking about makeup, right? Oh, we love this makeup. We love this makeup store. We know this makeup brand. We're not under the assumption that now we're going to go shopping to these makeup stores. Like, no.
Right.
Similar with sex. Just because I'm curious about your sexual health or, you know, what you like and dislike doesn't mean like, let's go for it.
Right. But after that conversation, if I was to be like, Ash, do you want to go shopping for makeup? And you say, yes, I would love to go shopping. Or no, I don't really want to go shopping right now.
Mm-hmm.
That would be when, like, the conversation of, like, do we want this to happen? Is this going to happen?
Exactly.
Good analogy. I like that. Now I want to go shopping. But like we're starting to kind of wrap up here. And so the last thing that I want to highlight is like you don't need a partner to enjoy great sex, right? Like not everyone has a partner. Not everyone wants a partner. Like some people are in between partners and you don't need one to have sex, right? And I think that's like a big like kind of idea that's held, you know, with like certain like populations or organizations or religious things, right? Is like you have to be like married or you have to be partnered for this, and that's not the case, right? It is okay, even healthy and encouraged, to masturbate regularly. Ash talked earlier about the health benefits of it. It has health benefits for your body and your mind. Therefore, if it is helping us, why are we not participating in it, right? Orgasms not only relieve stress, they also boost our immune system and burn calories, right? How many of you are calorie conscious and be burning and trying? Here's a new way that maybe you didn't know about.
Yes.
Indulge in whichever solitary sexual behavior brings you the most pleasure, right? It's up to you to choose how. And if you reach an orgasm, like that is your choice, right? That is you saying, like, I'm going to choose this method for this pleasure, right? For this outcome. And that is your choice. There are no rules. There's not a right way to do it, right? Like sexual pleasure is achieved as long as it's not a danger to you or anyone else, right? And we learn a lot about our sexual pleasures by trying new things and figuring out what feels good for us. And know that our sexual pleasures can evolve and things we used to like might not serve us anymore. We talked about that earlier. And that's totally okay and a normal part of it, right? And think about like when you take the time, whether you're like single or like you've never been in a relationship or whatever, like when you take the time to know what my body likes, what feels good for me, like what I'm not okay with, then think about like how much like even like better it is when you do find a sexual partner to be able to communicate that. It's not like a lot of unknowns, right? It's, hey, like I know my body, right? Like I've explored and figured out what feels good for me, and like I'm gonna communicate that with you, right? So I'm just gonna remember that, right? And no, a satisfying sex life really begins with understanding our own sexual needs and our responsibilities. And we are responsible for our own sexual pleasure, right? Then and only then we can acknowledge the needs and responsibilities of our partners, right? So it's a vital part of it.
Yes. Another mic drop.
Yeah, all the mic drops. But as we start to wrap up, we want to leave you with some quotes. And I think we picked 2 quotes for this episode because one, I think, is more centered towards pleasure, and one is more centered towards like sexual health in general. But I will read the first one, which is the pleasure focus, which is to reclaim the essential facets of our sexual health. It's time to affirm pleasure as your birthright and not an afterthought.
Ooh. Wow, that
our
hit really
birthright.
hard.
Wow, like they came with that word. Okay, here
not
for
an
it.
Afterthought. Yes.
Not an afterthought.
And so the second quote is more directed to the sexual health overall, and I'm gonna just say the person's name now because I'm gonna chop it up. Mia Yamanouchi.
I think it's how you say it.
Okay.
Or Maya. I don't know.
Maya. Okay. You know, she said this wonderful quote. Or they said this wonderful quote, okay? Know that you matter. Your thoughts and feelings matter. Your sexual needs and wants matter. Your sexual boundaries and sexual health matter. This is the definition of sexual empowerment. Ooh, yes. Yes.
Yes. If we feel empowered to take care of our physical health, if we feel empowered to take care of our mental health, which probably why you listen to our podcast in general, right? Then what do we need to do to get to the point where we feel empowered about our sexual health?
Exactly. Right? So to wrap up for sure at the end of this, right? Stay tuned for next month's episode. Y'all are going to love this. We already know. Okay, what to do if you have a loved one in an abusive relationship, featuring the wonderful, the one and only Cindy Grady. She's been on the pod before. In honor of October being Domestic Violence Awareness Month.
Yes, I'm so excited for Cindy to join us. If you listeners remember, last October she joined for the topic on it being Domestic Violence Awareness Month, and she gave such great insight. She talked about like the emotional abuse like wheel, which was so insightful, and I'm so excited for her to join again and talk about like, what do you do? Like, if you know someone that you love is in an abusive relationship, like what's in your power? Like, what can kind of like be helpful for you to feel like I'm not like losing my mind here or feeling like I'm not doing enough, right? Like, so something that I think I'm just really excited to hear her talk about.
Me too.
Definitely stay tuned. It's going to be so exciting. Yes. But with that, thank you again for tuning in, you wonderful, wonderful listeners. Yes. And we will see you next time. Bye.